thought I would read chapter 8, Song of Mornius. I read chapter 7 yesterday. I had added some stuff. It's really helpful to listen to myself read it too, to go back and listen. I don't think chapter 7 is done yet. I think it's rather rough, but I do think that the additional information I put in it as an explanation for how humans came to be on the earth was a good idea. I just think that it's a little overly dialogue. There's too much chit-chat. So I'm hoping to eventually flesh that chapter out a little bit. I am also ordering Dragon Naturally Speaking today because I'm running out of chapters that are in my computer. I'm coming to the point where I'm going to have to start reading from the written, from the what's printed out, and I refuse to do that until I type the chapter in, and I think it would just be easier to get Dragon Naturally Speaking to be able to do that. So anyway, I'm excited that progress is being made, and this is really helping me in a lot of ways. It's helping me to see people are actually reading it, and some even like it. It's helping me to hear the story. When I listen to the chapters myself, it really helps me to hear the story. And yeah, so it's a good thing. Okay, so onward and upward. This is now chapter 8, Song of Mornius. Galen lurched in rhythm with Ebony's long strides. Clutching at the back of the saddle, he fought to keep his seat as the horse strained upward. Ice and shale collapsed beneath runners and hooves as the third day brought them closer to the glacial summit of a snarl-tooth. Eyes closed, Galen leaned against Tarek. The thin air flayed his lungs, making him rasp with every breath. Tarek reined in sharply, then turned in the saddle to confront his men. "Take a rest, Galen," he said softly. Galen complied. With a grateful sigh, he slid from Ebony's rump. Pain stabbed through his knees as his feet hit hard ice. The muscles of his thighs spasmed in protest. Shivering, he limped with Mornius to a patch of dry ground and collapsed against the dark red shale. Dren Avram, clad in bull's hide black armor, strode toward him. A thin scar from temple to chin twisted his lip, turning his expression fierce. Never once had Galen seen him smile, yet the young man knelt beside him, unstopped his little flask, and handed it over as if they were comrades. Galen savored the companionship, the warmth that came from knowing he was accepted, even needed, by Tarek's men. He took his time with the hillfolk mead, sipping the roy slowly. From the edge of his vision he watched Dren shrug off his pack, the scar along the young man's cheek stretching the left corner of his mouth downward into a sneer. Studying him, Galen recalled Tarek's words. Other people were familiar with pain. In Dren's case, too familiar. "I'm sorry," he said. Dren glanced toward him and shrugged. "You're not the only one who's worn out, Galen Labal. Tarek's wise to let us rest here, even if it does slow us down." "No." Galen shook his head and gestured to the young man's scar. "I'm sorry for that. If I'd known you then, my staff could have healed you." Water trickled ceaselessly down the shale from the ice above while Dren fingered his scar. Galen watched as his piercing blue eyes studied the snow, then lifted to search his face. Galen shrank back. Dren's scrutiny uncovered every shame he had within him, every wrong he had committed, or had imagined carrying out. Trembling, Galen turned away. Blindly he thrust the flask toward Dren. Dren stayed his arm. "Keep it," he said softly, his breath clouding between them. "You'll need it again if we keep to this pace." With a grimace, Galen fastened the flask to his belt. Dren was right. He would need it. Already they had climbed higher than his mountain home. The air was thin and frigid, painful to breathe. He brushed the snow from his legs and lurched to his feet. Leaning on his staff, he scanned the white terrain. Tarek stood off to the side, tending his horse. Ebony's midnight coat was stark against the snow. At Galen's approach, Tarek smiled. His gloved fingers picked ice from the animal's tangled forelock. "How much further do you think we'll go? How long?" Galen broke off as Ebony lipped Tarek's sandy hair. Chuckling, Tarek rubbed the horse behind the ears. Then he sobered, his gaze on the distant clouds. 8 leagues if the weather holds. A storm like that. He jerked his chin at the darkening horizon. Could be the death of us, and Teardon. Galen eyed the distant storm. "Tarek, please don't make me ride any more. Not today." Bending, he rubbed at the muscles alongside his knees. Tarek flicked him a glance and shifted sideways to adjust the girth. He held the strap in his hand and pulled. "You're forgetting you're sick, Galen. You haven't been well since Meredith." Tarek swung easily into the saddle as Ebony stamped and fretted. Galen jumped to avoid the horse's hard hooves. "What I need," said Tarek, "is for you to recover. Then we'll discuss you walking." Tarek leaned over and caught Galen's arm. Then he lowered his voice. "Do as I say, staff wielder. You're too sick to walk, and you know it." Abruptly, Tarek's grip tightened, hauling him up behind the saddle. Something snapped inside Galen, and he found himself pushing against Tarek's back, struggling to get down. Without a word, Tarek backed in roughly among the low trees, dislodging a hail of grainy snow. Galen yelped as ice bit his neck, scattered cold before his eyes. In silence, Tarek kicked his mount free from the ice-heavy branches. Galen slumped forward against Tarek in defeat. At his master's urging, Ebony surged ahead, plunging through the deepening snow. The officers, men, and sleds followed in a single line behind them. Gradually, the sun sank beyond the jagged ridge to the west, lighting fire to the angry black clouds around and below. Tarek pulled Ebony up. Leather creaked as he turned in the saddle. Silently, he stared at his men, the somber faces of his officers. "We camp here," he said. Galen sat shivering beside Tarek. The light from the campfire warmed his face, brightening the tents behind him. As Vurgen piled on more wood, sparks shot upward, joining with the distant stars. The men huddled closer. For a while they jested, sharing stories so outlandish even Galen had to smile. Yet he ached for his friend. Tarek sat beside him, staring morosely at his hands, his fingers clenching his knees, until the dark-skinned Lieutenant Morriston leaned toward him from across the fire. "What is it, Commander? What's wrong?" Then Tarek stood slowly, his back stiff from his long ride. "I'm afraid we'll arrive too late, Lieutenant," Tarek said, his voice quieting his men. "Teardon might already be destroyed." The warriors were still, their silence around the fire louder than grief. The hired tenders of the sleds glanced at each other. Lieutenant Morriston threw a stick into the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. "We made a good effort, Commander, but we knew this thing was hopeless. Wheelermen have wings now. We can't match that." Ignoring the murmurs from the men around him, Morriston leaned closer to the flames. With a brusque movement, he shrugged his brown bearskin up his shoulders. "In my dreams, I saw Teardon in ruins," Tarek said. Shivering, he glanced at the starry sky. Then he reseated himself. "If you know it's hopeless, why keep us going?" Morriston stretched his arms toward the fire. "Why all this effort for a dead city?" Galen, glaring at the lieutenant, caught a breath through his teeth. Morriston was not Thelusian, was not from Thalos, he reminded himself. He was foreign, from the northern continent beyond the Isle of Giants, an outsider. Tarek glanced sideways at him. Catching his disapproval, Galen lowered his gaze. He shivered as the wind whipped through the trees, kicking up swirls of grainy snow. "Because we don't really know. It's only a feeling I have." Tarek leaned forward, peering at his third-in-command through the smoke. "Teardon's the heart of us, Morriston, the soul of this land. It preserves our history. It teaches us who we are. I'm hoping to hell I'm wrong, Lieutenant." Tarek paused, his hands shaking. Looking up, Galen tried to read his expression, but Tarek's face was turned. He stared again at the naked sky. Some of us have family there, Tarek said softly. Galen lowered his head. His gaze was drawn to the staff between his knees. Tyrdan. The voice spoke inside his skull, calming him. Galen closed his eyes. It was familiar, beloved, a friend from a time when he had none. Galen, listen, you must help them. He looked at Tarek, speaking softly to his men, reviving their hope even as his own seemed to fail. Climbing to his feet, Galen stamped the ice from his toes. He pushed himself free of the men and headed for the tent he and Tarek shared with Jürgen. His hands found the door flap, fumbling at leather already frozen to itself. Once inside, he hunkered down in the darkness, knelt on the pile of soft furs. Desire burned in his chest, the need to touch and feel, to join with the staff. Carefully he placed Mornius before him. Its gem pulsed a soft blue light. Galen leaned forward, pressing his hands, his weight against the gem. His skin glowed. He could see his tendons and bones, the dance of fire beneath his flesh. Light stabbed through his fingers, slashed on the bedrolls, packs, and furs. He focused inward, drawing himself into the skystone. Fire roared through him. He was power in blue flame unquenchable. Then he turned to compassion, radiated the warm colors of healing. Down further he changed to wisdom, the knowledge of life before time. With a groan he pulled back, reclaiming his independence. The staff hummed between his palms, revitalized by his joining, his presence. Sweat stung his eyes. Hands trembling, Galen sighed and curled up beside the staff. The soft, deep voices of the men carried him to sleep. Velrina Vlyn turned from the tarn's black water. Tyrdan, she whispered. Her voice echoed, a repeated hiss through the core of the mountain. Facing her rival, she lifted her staff, turned the eye of its blazoned stone toward him. You haven't the balls for it, mens. If the elves interfere. His fingers scratched at his uneven beard. At her words he snorted. If you mean the heiress, he sneered, I doubt they'd care. They are content within their great tree. They leave the city alone. No, Tyrdan is precious to them. They'd ward it, believe me. Velrina closed her eyes. She sensed Wheeler near, the spirit of the great wizard forever trapped in the murky water beneath her. I am your link to Malian, she thought, your pathway to new life. In exchange, I give my god a taste of your power. She smiled to herself. Men's old magic devoured his mind, feasted on his body like a cancer. His attempt to master the planet's native magic was killing him, leaving her whole and unscathed, healthy enough to rule their new world without him. A city of treasures. Men's words were broken, punctuated by his breath. If I conquer Tyrdan and shatter its magic, think how the elves would react. None would dare fight against me. Even your precious Tarek would run away. Her cheeks flamed as she turned to face him. His wide eyes captured the light from across the room, the lonely torch she had brought from above. Something about his expression caught at her, conjuring visions of the future Malian planned. If none oppose you? She broke off. His eyes bulged, his lips twitched back in a savage grin. Yes, he whispered. A new world will be born, created by Malian from Talankai's ashes. A whole new world for humans to rule. Velrina studied him. She doubted very much he would live to see that day. Even now he was nothing but bones, his skin stretched taut over his forehead and skull. Yet he was animated, driven by the ruthless fire of his magic-devoured soul. All you think of is war, isn't it? She glanced at a shadow, a tall, slender shape beside the torch. Respectful as always, her apprentice Gulgrin stared back, his young eyes glistening as he watched her every move. We can't do anything without food, mens, and our suppliers refuse us. Without their tithe. Men snorted. That's your business, Velrina, your problem. If your farmers won't cooperate, seize their crops, make those fools into warriors for me. She glared into space, swallowing as she tasted his words. If only I could, she thought. I hate begging, and those dirt grubbers know it. Ah, but then... Falrina shook her head. A quick fix won't do it, Mens. What about later, when all the farmers are gone? How will you fight with starving men? Mens bit his lip. The gesture was familiar. It reminded her of the deep-thinking young man who had introduced her to the peace of Malian's darkness. For a moment she ached for him, for the human he had once been. She watched as he turned to the pool. They won't starve, he whispered. Not if you give me the time I need. Feed them the farmers or captives if you must. What do I care what my warriors eat, as long as they can fight? Feed them the... Falrina broke off to catch her breath. Men spun around and glared. Does that shock you? He asked darkly. From the way I see it, you have little choice. How can we keep prisoners if we're short on food for ourselves? So forget it. Give the prisoners you can't use to my warriors as food. Meat is meat, as the prowlers would say. No. As her staff flared, crimson fire licked at her wrist. She paused and exhaled slowly. Though the idea of cannibalism sickened her, she would not admit it to Mens. You forget, she said, I'm not like you. My mind is clear. Malian feeds on slow destruction, on suffering and pain and torture. Those people in the dungeons give him strength even now. If I take away their suffering, then be creative, Mens snapped. He gestured at the pool, at the dark, sleeping water. You have Veeler's skill at your command, and Malian's too. Turn those people into Veelermen, Falrina. Make them so they don't have to eat. She glared at him. I can shape bones and skin into wings, men, but I can't change what organs do. Even Veeler has his limits. Mens averted his gaze from her staff's bright flames, Malian's power he craved for himself. Ignoring him, she turned to the water. She reached with her mind to soothe Veeler's dead soul. Time, Falrina. Mens thumped the granite floor with his staff. It takes time to kill a world. And warriors, do you hear me? As the fire faded from her staff, Falrina nodded.